I am going to talk on the topic Black spiritual revival. Black spiritual revival. And I want to try to put this in a context to hopefully make it plain and simple. We are in the midst of a global great awakening. And what do I mean by this? I mean that we are in a period of time where Black people worldwide are becoming conscious of the past. With the internet and with advanced technology that exists now, the world is getting smaller and smaller in terms of consciousness, and people are able to reach back and get information that was very difficult to get in the past. There was a time when you'd have to go to the library, and sometimes you'd have to travel to different libraries to do research and find information, because information wasn't evenly distributed everywhere. There was some concentrations of information in certain places and none in others. And it became such that over time, you had Black scholars did research and they pulled together information from various different places, and they tried to make it available in publishings such as Dr. Chancellor Williams wrote a book called The Destruction of Black Civilization. You had Professor Cheikh Anta Diop wrote a book entitled The African Origin of Civilization. You had Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan write a book called Black Man of the Nile and His Family, and the African origins of the major Western religions. You also had a host of other writers like Martin Delany and J.A. Rogers and W.E.B. Du Bois and so many others who did the research, who traveled to different places, who dug for the information, and dug deep to try to unravel the information and discover the truth. And you had people that preserved documents throughout history, and they developed collections, library collections that they preserved and that have been passed down in special collections in major libraries all around the country and actually all around the world. There were artifacts from the African continent taken and stored in museums in Britain and France and all over the world. And so when we began to look at this, that all of this information now that has been collected, much of it has been digitized, and many of it is now accessible through the internet because of the advances in technology, and the access to information has become more sophisticated and easier to get information. So there's a flood of information that's going on right now. And some of the information is overwhelming for people. People can't process it fast enough. They're not able to assimilate it into their worldview. And it's a slow process that's taking place. And if we take a look at this and see this process, we can go back to a period of time, for example, during the time of Marcus Garvey. There was talk of African redemption, and there was this so-called African redemption movement that was going on, and many people didn't understand what this movement was all about. It actually was about the fact that you had Black people in the Americas, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, and primarily focusing on the Western Hemisphere, where you had a bunch of Black folk who were disconnected from Black history because why? They were separated from knowledge of the past because of the conditions that existed during slavery, because of the conditions that existed during Jim Crow segregation. And there were masses of Black people who were completely cut off from any knowledge of their past. And there were all kinds of substitutes that came into being whether it was a religious substitute, and there were also many identity type substitutes that came in, of people groping in the darkness, searching for some kernel of truth to try to unravel the mystery and understand the identity of Black people, and asking the question of why. Why is it that we suffer so? Why is it that we go through Jim Crow segregation? Why is it that we went through slavery? Why is it that we are treated the way that we are? Why is it the fact that we're discriminated against? This question of why. You've had Black people for generations, and you can go back, and we could go back 500 years. And 500 years ago, the first documented Africans came to North America as part of the Elian colony. And they established a colony, the European and Spanish colony that was established along the P. Diddy River in South Carolina, between South Carolina and Georgia region. And this colony that was developed brought about 100 Black Africans from Angola in a colony of about 600 people, including about 500 YT people, Spanish. And the Blacks actually rebelled against this colony and teamed up with Native Americans, and they destroyed the colony. But the Black people, they mixed in. They separated themselves, and they became what became later known as maroon colonies. And sometimes they stayed independent. Other times they attached themselves to Native Americans and became part of Native American groups. And very often, though separated, they found a bond in relationship with Native Americans. And so we can go back 500 years and see this is this maroon group of people that broke away from the Spanish colony in 1526. That was 500 years ago. And then we can look at and see that in 1619, there are reported to be like 20 Black people came as slaves to the Virginia colony in 1619. And this group of people that came in 1619 as slaves, that they became the foundational group of Black people in North America that were part of the British colonies. And we can then see how the transatlantic slave trade transpired, and we see the number of Black people that come in to North America through the British colonies. We also see the fact that millions more are coming through the Caribbean from the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French, the British, and a host of other European powers that became involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And we can look at this information, and we can actually study and look at the lifestyle that people underwent. They were held in the hull of ships. They were captured. They were brutalized. They were placed in a situation where they were became chattel slaves, the property of others, and they weren't allowed to learn to read and write. They weren't allowed to transmit information from one generation to the next. They were denied the opportunity to speak their own language. They could be punished or even unalive for speaking their own language. And they found themselves in a generational situation of oppression and brutality. And they were separated in terms of a person would, let's say, have a child and begin a family, and their children would be sold off. Their spouse would be sold off to other plantations, and they may never see each other again in their entire life. And what happened is this broke down families. Families were broken and separated, and there was no institutional structure to pass down information from one generation to the next. So people began to lose the memory of Africa. People began to lose the memory of the transatlantic slave trade. People began to lose the memory of the oppression, because each generation that passed, some of these things became more and more remote in the background, and only the pain and suffering that they experienced during their generation that they remember vividly. And so they all, during this time, there were Black people who were documenting the atrocities that went along. But the masses of black people didn't have access to this data. The masses of black people didn't have access to this information. So most black people went through their entire life cut off from knowledge, cut off from the total connection to the black community, and only connected to a local group that they shared in common the experience of being enslaved, etc. And so when we look at how this unfolded, there were about 246 years of slavery in the British colonies, and much longer than that in the wider scope in the Western Hemisphere. And then after that, there was 99 years of Jim Crow segregation. And so when we began to look at the kinds of oppression, we see another 61 years of institutional racism. And this is when we get a civil rights bill and we get a voting rights bill. But there's still an effort to suppress us. There's still an effort to stop us from making progress. There's still an effort to deny us our civil rights and human rights. And there's this constant struggle that black people are going through. And so there is a spiritual revival taking place, a black spiritual revival, because black people are becoming consciousness. They're developing a consciousness of what it means to be black. And this experience of blackness, it's a spiritual experience that black people are having. Of course, it has a physical nature to it as well, but it's a spiritual experience that only black people are experiencing because they are suffering the trauma. They are going through the tragedy, the situations that have imposed upon black people so much pain and suffering over the years. And so they are the recipients of generations of trauma that is this part of the black experience, this part of the black heritage. And so black people find themselves in a situation where you still have, black people are, racially profiled by the police. So black children grow up and they see black people being harassed by the police or just stopped for being black. And they find themselves in a situation where they are constant on edge because they realize that racism is a real thing in this world. They experience going to the bank and not being able to get a loan where a YT person could go get a loan, or try to rent an apartment, but that a YT person can go and rent without a question. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this black experience, this traumatic black experience, there is a black spiritual revival going on, and it's a global great awakening because black people worldwide are becoming conscious of what happened to black people, and they're becoming conscious of the black experience. And there are frankly also other groups of people that are becoming aware of the black experience. They're becoming aware of what happened to black people and what continues to happen to black people. And so it's having a transformative impact worldwide, globally. And there's still also this group of people who continue to try to promote this worldwide YT supremacy. They still attempt to promote racism as a fundamental principle of civilization that they promote for them to try to remain in power. And so there's this tension, this conflict that's taking place. It's a spiritual warfare that's going on, and there's a spiritual revival going on because people are becoming conscious and aware of what's going on. And it boils down to a battle between good and evil, between right and wrong, between truth and falsehood. And so when we begin to really look at and understand, where we are, I want to give an example of something I think that's very critical for us to recognize. I want you to just imagine with me for a minute and think about a child born during slavery, and he knows his mother, at least for a little while before he gets sold off, but he gets to know his mother. And then at some point he realizes that he's the victim. He is the offspring of an assault on his mother. And so he has within him the trauma of having part of the identity of the slave master. He has within him the trauma of the culture that is oppressing him because he's still treated as chattel, as property. And so inside of him, he's going through an internal conflict. And over time, because he's disconnected from knowledge, because he's disconnected from his heritage, he's disconnected from the history of his own people and his own family and his mother. And he's disconnected from the community of people who are experiencing the same thing, the same trauma, the same racism that he's experiencing. They find themselves in a troubled situation, having a troubled mind, and they're searching for identity. So over a period of time, they are offered opportunities like a cloak, a coat to put on to keep, to keep warm in the wintertime. So someone comes along and tells them, well, you're descendants of Moroccans born in America. And even though that's not true, many accept it because they don't have any other choice or any other viable alternative because they don't know. They're cut off from information. And in addition, you have others that come along and they say, well, look, no, you're Asiatic black. And so they accept that because that's the extent of the knowledge that's available to them at the time. And then comes along, someone says that, oh, well, you're a black Hebrew. And so you have others that come along and that offer a host of different false identities. And these identities are accepted by many people because they are confused. They don't know. They don't have any real information that actually establishes the truth of who they are. And they accept the imperfect and imprecise and incomplete information that is available to them at that time. They are struggling. They are groping in darkness, searching for a kernel of truth, trying to find out and understand who they are. So they say, well, there are Black, Aboriginal, Native Americans. They start trying to establish identities and a way to self-identify. You have groups saying, well, they're foundational Black Americans and they are Aboriginal this and that, and they are the ADOS, and they come up with all kinds of definitions and delineations of identity. When we look at the actual reality of it, they all have incomplete information. They all take a little kernel of truth and they take it and magnify it and make it into something and create something out of it creative that's not true ultimately, that it only has a little speck or kernel of truth within it. And they take that and then the rest of it they guess and they speculate and they build upon. And so you have this identity crisis of all of these factional groups that are working in many cases against each other and opposing each other and arguing over who's right and who's wrong and who really has the truth. And they're divided. And this is a process that's often promoted by the enemies of Black people to keep us divided so that we're not able to come together, so that we're not able to organize, so that we're not able to stand up and defend ourselves and be in a position to be able to organize to make mutual progress. And so we began to look at and understand the reality of this experience. And when we look at this in this context, I want to emphasize the fact that we are in a Black spiritual revival. We are in a global great awakening. And what we are in is we are in a process of internal, of psychological, of mental, of spiritual development, where we are growing, that we started out in this process, in essence, as a child, and we're growing and maturing, and we're moving in a direction to help us become fully mature. And it's a Black spiritual revival. We are growing our spiritual selves, our spiritual body. We're growing in understanding. We're growing in knowledge. And this is a process we're going through. So we have to look at it and understand it, because you can actually take a snapshot in time, and you can see us divided, where we got people that are saying, well, I'm a black Moor, and others saying, well, I'm a Asiatic black, and others saying, well, I'm a black Hebrew, and others saying, well, I'm a black Indian, or others saying, I'm a black this and black that. And what's happening is it is a process that we're going through in terms of our own spiritual and psychological and mental development. We are going through the development of our cognitive model of who we are and how we connect to each other and how we connect to the world. And it's a process of growth that we're going through. But if we look at this process of growth and understand what is the end result thereof, what is the ultimate destination of this process of growth, in other words, when we fully grow up and become fully mature, what do we become? And if we look at this and understand that we become in a black international consciousness, international black consciousness, we become fully understanding of the historical processes that put black people in the conditions that we're in worldwide. We become fully conscious of global YT supremacy. We become fully conscious of the source and existence of racism in the world today. And so we find ourselves in a spiritual revival because we are stirring up within our community and amongst each other. We're going through this process of growth. We're going through this process of development. And I've used the example of the Azusa Street revival, that in about 1906, there was a small group of people that got together for a prayer meeting in Los Angeles, in a Los Angeles home in California. And this small prayer group over a number of years evolved into a global movement with over 600 million people involved. This small ideal that started in a prayer meeting, that started in a group of people that got together in a house, and they sat down together, and this ideal that they nurtured expanded to 600 million people. And if you look at the example of this, the model of this, of the Azusa Street revival, and recognize and understand that if we look at the black experience, what 700 million black people have experienced in the diaspora, and if we look at the experience of 1.3 billion people on the African continent, and a total of about 2 billion people worldwide, black people, who have experienced the African Holocaust, whose ancestors experienced the slave trades, the transatlantic slave trade, the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade, the Trans-Sahara slave trade, and whose ancestors experienced the devastation of the African continent, the African Holocaust, 10 to 15 million unalived in the Congo Free State by King Leopold, and millions more by other groups, including the genocides of the genocide against the Herero and Nama people of Southwest Africa, and the Shark Island massacres and the concentration camps, and the atrocities against the Matabele people in the Matabele Wars in Southern Africa by Cecil Rhodes, with the British developing De Beers diamonds. And when we look all across the continent and see the atrocities committed by Lord Kitchener and so many other Europeans that came in and commit atrocities against black people. If we go back and look at the Arabs and Berbers that committed atrocities against black people, and we go all the way back to the foundation of race-based chattel slavery to 652 CE, and we see its origins with the Arab conquest of Byzantine Egypt and their attacks into Nubia. If we begin to become mature and understand the history of what happened, and to be able to piece together all of the pieces, it defines for us our identity. It establishes with maturity who we are and how we connect to each other. And it's critical for us to make this leap, this growth, and to be an active and conscious participant in this Black spiritual revival. Because this Black spiritual revival, it cannot be stopped. It is something that is inherent in nature. Nature has produced it because it is within the context of the experience that Black people have had historically. And because of the reality of the historical Black experience, as we understand it and recognize it, and as we share it and discuss it with each other, as we share it and discuss it with others, it has a transformative impact, because we have to recognize the fact that, and you can look, for example, just recently in the last couple of weeks, Marco Rubio, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, he spoke at a conference in Munich, Germany, and a group, international group of Europeans were all together there, and he got there and he spoke, and he actually told them that they should not be embarrassed, or they should not be feel guilt, or shame because of the history of slavery and colonialism. That they should be proud of these things, that they shouldn't have any shame for these things. And he promoted this ideal of global white supremacy, of this superiority of Western civilization, that this group of people should be the dominant group, that they have the right to oppress other people, that they have the right to do the things that they've done, and that they shouldn't feel any shame about it, that they shouldn't feel any guilt about it. And this ideal was being promoted, and this is the ideal now that is taking control of the political environment in the United States through the alt-right movement, and then the MAGA movement. And this is what the president himself represents and promotes, the same ideology. And it's anti-Black. It is anti-human progress. And it is a distortion of reality. And if we understand the Black spiritual revival, the Black spiritual revival is not something that's looking at it and saying, okay, it's this special thing that Black people are creating or something like that. No, it is a natural phenomenon that is part of the existence of nature itself, because it grows out of the actual common experience. It is natural. It is part of nature. And when we look at this and understand this is nature, is part of natural law. And it's important to be able to understand and recognize that, because this ideal that there's somehow this white supremacy, and that somehow they are more intelligent, or they have some divine right, this is all contrived. It's all false and artificial. It's fake. It's a lie. It's not based in truth. And it has caused all kinds of destruction and havoc in the world. And the reality of it is that it is something that's on its way out. And they are on their last leg, and they will try to destroy the whole earth rather than to see balance come to the world and to acknowledge their atrocities, to acknowledge the things that they've done. And rather than admit the kinds of things that they've done, and their immorality and their wickedness, their hatred, their xenophobia, their racism, rather than admit these things and repent, they continue to try to double down on it. And the only thing they'll do is bring destruction to themselves. They'll do a lot of damage to the rest of the world, but ultimately they'll destroy themselves. They'll bring themselves to an end, because it's inherent in the nature of their evil. It's inherent in the nature of their wickedness. And so it's important for us to recognize this Black spiritual revival that's going on. I think about, and I go back to, as a small child, I can remember as a small child, my first encounter with racism was that K organization burnt a cross in front of our house when I was a small child. My father tried to open a store along the main corridor, and he was able to rent some space, and they tried to deter him and they threatened him, and but he went on and he opened the store anyway. And what they did was they retaliated, and they came and burnt a cross in front of a house and tried to intimidate him and threaten him, and to stop him from being able to do this. Of course, he went on and he did it anyway, and had to defend himself. But this was my experience coming up. And then also, I can remember as a small child that on the television, we had a black and white television, and on this, I heard stories that went all the way back to Daisy Bates and the Little Rock Nine, and these 9 little black children who just simply wanted to get a quality education, of how they were the school doors were blocked by the governor, and how they intimidated and threatened, and then eventually the president had to send in the National Guards to escort these students to be able to go to school, because the law had changed, and the law said that they could go to school, and then denying them the opportunity to education on the basis of their race was unlawful. And this had to be enforced by the federal government. And there was just so much mass resistance to this. I could see this as a small child in the television right in front of me. And then I grew up in an environment where I'm watching this and I'm hearing about and seeing the TV program that is looking at Medgar Evers being unalived. And I'm seeing the funeral of Emmett Till and how he looked in when he was displayed after being unalived by racists, and so in terms of, I grew up seeing these things on a regular daily basis. I watched the reports from the 16th Street Baptist Church when 4 little girls were unalived and by racists. And I watched my mother come to tears and cry because she had visited that church many times when she lived in Birmingham, Alabama. And so I grew up in this kind of environment, seeing these kinds of things. And then I can remember seeing Bloody Sunday in the news, and seeing Bull Connor sicking dogs on black people who were marchers and demonstrators. And I can remember all the unrest that was going on and the conflict that was going on. And black people were marching for civil rights. Black people were demanding freedom, justice, and equality. I remember Goodman, Cheney, and Schweener, when this interracial group of people were unalived for registering black people to vote in Mississippi. And I remember all of these things as a small child growing up. And this experience that I went through, and seeing black men harassed by the police in my neighborhood, in my community, seeing discrimination taking place against black people in my community, hearing the stories of the elders and the people in my community that talked about racism and the experience that they were having on a day-to-day basis. I can remember when Martin Luther King was unalived, and how the National Guard occupied Wilmington, Delaware, the community that I grew up in, that they occupied the city for almost a year. They put the National Guard in, and there were troops on the streets. And I can remember military personnel going through the neighborhoods, these are experiences that I grew up with, in terms of looking at and understanding that racism was real, that racism was a something that was it was lethal, it was dangerous, it was deadly. And I saw so much of the result of racism, and people that were traumatized, and I saw the injury to people and their experience from having been the victim of racism. And so I grew up in this environment and understanding the reality of this experience, and understanding this was real. And I grew through a period of time of recognizing how during the time of like the Black Panther Party and the struggles, and them unaliving Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and I saw the struggles of black people. I remember when Watts burned. I remember all of the conditions that existed all across the country when there were riots after the unaliving of Dr. Martin Luther King. And then I can remember the black people struggling, working to make a better life, to build a better quality of life, to gain access to public education. And I even became an activist and became involved in civil rights and became a leader of several different organizations. And I can remember getting a NAACP award at the age of 16 years old, and going through a period of time where I actively had to struggle against racism and to open the door for rights and to be able to get rights and claim rights for myself and to fight against racism and and the experience of fighting against racism for my community and my family and my loved ones. And so in terms of going through this whole experience, I also remember going through a revolution in consciousness, because at one time I was part of the Moorish science. At one time I was a person that believed I was an Asiatic black. At one time I was a person that believed I was a black Hebrew. At one point I believed I was a black Native American. At one point I believed in all of these different identities. And I went through a metamorphosis, a process of growth. And as I went through this process of growth and became more and more mature, I began to recognize and understand who I am and understand myself in a global context. I reached out and I built my ability to be able to travel. So I traveled to Africa in search of my roots. I went out and I explored and I researched. I even traveled to other countries and other parts of the world to explore my history and try to learn about my own history and discover myself and discover my true identity. In this history, this study of Black history, I began to become involved in diligent study of Black history by not only Black American scholars, but global Black scholars. And so I went and visited the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, and I read Professor Cheikh Anta Diop's books. And I got a chance to meet with many of the people there and travel and visit his village. And I went to Nigeria and met Dr. Adi Ajay, who was a renowned scholar, and got a chance to study and learn some from him and read his books. And I got a chance to meet with the Oni of Ife and to have an audience with him and sit all day and talk with him and to learn about the history of the Yoruba people and about the history of West Africa. And I got a chance to engage in a lot of experiences that many of my peers didn't get to engage in. Many of my peers, they were back, just trying to hustle, to try to make a living, to try to make ends meet, or they were just involved in going to a ritual church every week, or they were involved in all these kinds of things while I was exploring the world, while I was out learning, seeking to discover, while I was fulfilling the scripture that I had read. Because I had read the Bible, the whole thing, multiple times before. And there was a scripture that said that God hides a matter, but it is the heart of the king to search it out. And there was a scripture that said, "It has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth." And I read that and I believed it and believed that this applied to me. And I felt like I was a king. And so I searched out the truth, and I was on a mission to search out the truth. And so this was part of my experiences. This is part of what I went through in growing. And I got a chance to sit down and meet with and talk with and get to know Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan. I got a chance to sit down with Dr. Ivan Sertima, and I went through all kinds of programs with Dr. Asante at Temple University and with many, many other Black scholars from all around the world. And so I found myself in a situation where I was devouring information. I was studying and researching and reading every book that I could get my hands on to learn more and more about Black people and the Black experience. And I got a chance to meet with black people from all over the country and to sit down and talk with black people and learn about their experiences, that they were experiencing some of the same things that they experienced, the same things I went through. We had a common experience in terms of the kinds of oppression and atrocities that were committed against our people. And I got a chance to see firsthand and have a front row seat and understand what was happening in the world and in understanding the black experience. And so I experienced the black experience firsthand. So I got the spiritual enrichment and the understanding that comes from the black experience. And so I found myself in a situation where I began to realize and understand through the studying of the Pan-African movement and doing significant research regarding the Pan-Africanism and Pan-African movement. I began to recognize that black people in America, we weren't the only ones that went through this experience. There were black people in Brazil, there were black people in Colombia and Venezuela and Costa Rica, Nicaragua, the Honduras and the Caribbean and Mexico. There were black people all out the Western Hemisphere who were brought as slaves, who went through a period of slavery and then a period of segregation, that they admixed in with some of the native population, some of the European population. And I began to recognize all of these and to begin to see that there were black people who spoke Dutch. There were black people who spoke Portuguese. There were black people that spoke French. There was black people who spoke Spanish. There were black people who spoke English. And I realized the connection that I had to them, that we were all part of the same black family, that at our root, our history goes back to this experience of the African Holocaust. And I began to recognize this connection that we have with the black people on the continent of Africa and the atrocities that they went through. And I began to realize this connection, that we were a global black family. And as I began to recognize that this experience and I listened to all the debates about whether we should be Negroes or black or how we should identify. And I realized that the word black was a word that's a polysemous word. It's the word black. It's a word that's subject to multiple meanings. And so if we look at it and understand it, it's like bark. The word bark could be the sound that a dog makes, but bark could also be the skin on a tree. It's a word that's polysemous, is subject to multiple different meanings. And in the context of black people, of black Americans, of black people worldwide, black is a designation of an experience. It is a designation of a people that have a common experience of the African Holocaust. And it's talking about a common experience that binds us together. And this is the designation and the significance of the word. And so when I began to recognize and understand this and rise above the BS conversations that I was hearing and in all of the stuff that people were confused over, I began to recognize that, yes, there were melanated peoples all over the planet. Because when I studied the history of Africa and understand how black people were born in Africa, how people were born in Africa, and then migrated out and spread out around the globe. And when I began to study that in its detail and understand the distinction and significance, I realized there were melanated groups of people all around the world. And these melanated groups around the people, of people from all around the world, they didn't all have the black experience. They didn't all have the same experience that the sub-Saharan black African that was taken into slavery and that was distributed around the world through the slave trade and that occupied the African continent that was subjugated, that we had a distinctive experience. And yes, other marginalized people from around the world, whether they were Asians or Indians or whatever, they also experienced atrocities. And it's important for us to recognize and understand that. And this is why I have so much respect for the Bandung Conference and what was attempted to be achieved at the Bandung Conference. But I also recognize that there is a distinction between all of these different groups and black people. And what happens is so many people are confused and they don't understand this distinction of this experience of the African Holocaust, of what happened to black people that were taken from the African continent, and then their journey and their experience and atrocities that they experienced through slavery, through segregation, through institutional racism, and also recognizing how we connect to all these other groups of people who were marginalized, these other groups of people who had their land taken, these other groups of people who atrocities were committed against. It's important for us to recognize in the distinct issue of blackness and of the black spiritual revival, because it is the global common thread. It is a global common thread that binds the whole world together, not just black people, but everybody. It is the foundational basis of global unity. And black people are at the core and at the center of it, because it is this common human experience in understanding how nature fits into this, and how this common experience that we have, that the revelation and knowledge of this common experience puts down any lie that they try to come up with. When they try to say, oh, well, the black people were backwards, and so, it was a blessing for them to become slaves because we brought them into civilization and we did this and that, and, all that kind of BS. Once you really understand the history, you can go back and look at Count C.F. Volney, who was a European who actually wrote in a book called Ruins of Empires. He talked about, he said, those piles of ruins that you see, along the Nile, of Thebes in her 100 palaces, the monument of the caprice of destiny, that they're a people now forgotten because of their black skin and woolly hair, discovered the very principles on which the universe is governed. They discovered these principles that were the foundation of human civilization. So these black people, these people with black skin and woolly hair, these sub-Saharan black Africans, that this group of people created the whole foundation of the civilization that Europeans are even functioning under. In other words, like, you wouldn't even have a civilization had it not been for black people. You're children. You're the children of black people. And you're like a wicked child who's wreaked havoc in the home and has caused all kinds of chaos and destruction in the home. But we've had patience with you. And we've dealt with you like you were a wicked, wayward child. And we have gone through the suffering, and we've gone through the patience and the experience to try to redeem you, to try to help you become a decent human being. And if we look at it, even if we understand the whole concept of the so-called Savior God religions, the first one was the Herut, born of the Virgin Isis. And you look at his life and parallel that with Mary and Jesus. And you look at it and understand, and you see that there's like 16 of these stories all around the world that have had an impact. And you begin to really understand the metaphor, that it's a story that is it's an idiom, it's a metaphor, it is a allegory that is telling you a deeper truth. And this is why, for example, in the Bible, it says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, right? That it is a metaphor. It's metaphorical. And it's telling you about something that actually is happening historically. Though many of us are immature and we don't really understand how to read it. We don't understand the significance of metaphor, how to read the metaphor. So you got people shouting hallelujah in the church, and they don't really even know or understand what they're doing. They're just simply there and putting money in the plate and paying for the preacher's Cadillac, And so in terms of looking at and understanding the reality of what Scripture is telling us, it's telling us the story of black people. It's telling you the story of a group of people who came willingly and who sacrificed themselves for humanity, for the common good, for everyone. They went through suffering. They went through all kinds of atrocities, were crucified, and they were unalive and resurrected. And if we understand the metaphor of this story, this is the story of Black people worldwide. This is the story of the experience of Black people. This is the essence and meaning of the story. And so in terms of understanding this story and understanding the context of this story, we are right now in a Black spiritual revival because we are in this period of time of unprecedented growth, of unprecedented maturity. We have many of our people that are still struggling. Many of our people are arguing amongst each other, and they're fighting over the identity of whether they are a Moor or Asiatic Black, or whether they are a Hebrew, or whether they are a Black Aboriginal Native American, or whether they are multiple other different false identities. And so the reality of it is that the mature Black person moves through a series of phases. They go through this, what they call the cross model of ethnic identity development. It was a model developed by Professor William Cross, who was a Black psychologist. And what he does is he points out and identifies the fact that Black people go through this series of ethnic identity development, very similar to everyone else, but he identifies it specifically for Black people and points out the fact that Black people, you take a small child, and that small child is totally unconscious of race. They're totally oblivious to the issues of race. And they'll go out and they'll play with, other ethnic groups, whether they're YT kids or Asian or whatever. They'll play and they'll get along and they'll, fight, and then they'll make up, and they'll, but they never are conscious of race. Race isn't a matter for them. And they just go along normally, and they evolve and get together, and they enjoy each other's company and friendship, and, and have a beautiful experience. But what happens is one day, and this is what happened in the Black experience because of the prevalence and existence of racism as a cultural development, a cultural artifact of slavery and segregation, and that was produced by Europeans and Arabs and Berbers, and through Islam and Christianity and Judaism. If we begin to look at these systems that are put in place, what happens is Black children, then they have an encounter, and they go through this pre-encounter, and then they have this encounter. And this encounter may be that they're called the N-word. This encounter may be that they experience racism firsthand. They experience that they're being treated differently because of their skin color, because of their race. They either witness and see someone being mistreated for being Black, and they experience themselves, and they get a distinctive understanding, and they're confronted with this issue of their racial identity, and realize that their racial identity is the source of trauma. It's the source of pain. It's the source of being treated differently. And when they do this, they begin to then search for why. So they go into an immersion, and they go back and forth through this process. So they may immerse themselves, and they may begin to study and try to figure out who they are, and they conclude, well, I'm a Moor, and then they emerge as a Moor, and they take on a Moorish identity. And then eventually what happens is they discover new information and realize they're not a Moor, and then they immerse again, and they may come back and say they're Asiatic Black, and they will then discover that that's not who they are either, and they will immerse themselves again, and they'll come back and they may say, well, I'm a Black Hebrew, and then when they emerge, they'll realize and come in contact with information that challenges them again, and they realize they're not a Black Hebrew. They immerse themselves, and they go through this cycle over and over and over again until they reach the status where they emerge as an international Black, as with the international Black identity. They emerge with a universal understanding of the history of what happened, to understand the nature of who they are based on facts and truth. And as a consequence of this process, they then develop a stable understanding, and they begin to have a stable identity, and they begin to reach out and become part of a global community. And that doesn't mean that they become anti-YT people. It doesn't mean they become anti-Asian or anything like that. It just means they become conscious of who they are. And they realize that if you have a problem with me and who I am, then there's something wrong with you. There's not something wrong with me. I'm who I am, and I'm proud of who I am. There is a great heritage that I have. And when I look at my heritage and fully understand who I am within the context of the world, who are you to question me? You don't have any basis to question me. You don't even have any right to question me. In fact, you don't even know who you are. Because now I'm mature enough and I have enough maturity and understanding that not only do I know who I am, I know who you are. And I realize you don't know who you are. And that's the reality of this kind of growth through this Black spiritual revival. And so this is the era of time that we're in. We're in this era of time where we are the teachers of humanity. We are the ones who are designated that our purpose is to raise up humanity. And we do it through this Black spiritual revival by sharing this information, by sharing this truth, by teaching the history so people can understand what happened, so people can understand it. Because ultimately it has to affect world and global policy on how we treat each other and how we interact with each other. And if we go through a full understanding and develop, what will happen, those people who've committed atrocities, those people whose ancestors have done these things, eventually they'll repent, or they will no longer exist. They will cease to exist. They will destroy themselves. It is in the nature. It is in nature. It's part of nature, because they won't be naturally selected going forward. They will become obsolete. They will become useless to humanity. They will become extinct on their own, because they will be like rotten fruit that falls from the tree and just rots away. Now, it might stink a while, and it might draw insects and vermin while it's rotting, but it's rotten fruit, and it will rot away, and it will cease to exist. And so the reality of our experience is that we have to understand where we are and recognize the fact that we are in a Black spiritual revival. And when I say this, when I say a Black spiritual revival, think of the word Black as not as a color, but think of Black as an experience. It is a spiritual revival surrounding the experience of Blackness, the experience of the African Holocaust, the experience of the kinds of atrocities and evil committed against part of humanity. And so when we began to really, really recognize and understand this, it's only through this understanding that we'll be able to develop mutual cooperation globally and begin to work together and build a harmonious community and begin to recognize that the whole planet is under threat. We have global warming issues. We have millions of people, billions of people who live along the coastlines of the continents of the earth. And because of global warming, because of rising water levels, because of the melting of the polar caps, and we can see the fact that coastlines that hold cities and towns and areas where millions of people live are under threat because of global warming, where the waters will rise and overcome those regions and those places become uninhabitable. We can look at the issue of storms and earthquakes and the geology of the earth and understand the natural geology and also understand the human impact of man's behavior on that geology and began to recognize how to try to mitigate those damages and work in cooperation so that humans can survive. We also can look at global food, hunger, of being able to feed 8.3 billion people and the challenges associated with that, of looking at the other issues like there's a program, there's actually a global program in NASA, they call it NEO, the Near Earth Object Program. But there are countries all around the world who are peering through telescopes and using technology to monitor and scan, because every day there are asteroids that pass by the Earth that pose a threat to the Earth's atmosphere, and that a catastrophic asteroid impact from a large enough asteroid could wipe us out just like the dinosaurs were wiped out. And so human consciousness and our science has grown and evolved to the point where we can see this as a challenge. So we have young people now who are going to school, who are learning, who are studying, who are developing technology to try to mitigate the potential for an impact, of whether it is to find a way to change the trajectory of an asteroid that could impact Earth, whether it's to destroy the asteroid and break it up in small pieces so that the small pieces burn up in the Van Allen belts entering Earth's atmosphere so that they're not a threat. And so we also have multiple other areas of science, whether it is in just biology, in epidemiology, and looking at the fact that if we understand history and go through history, there have been pandemics that wiped out massive numbers of people, and doing just in a short period of time, a disease, a bacteria, a virus. And so we have people that are studying, understanding how to meet the challenge of the epidemiological reality that we could be wiped out by a virus. And so people are learning how to challenge these viruses and how to mitigate, to find cures, to find a way to stop these from spreading. They're finding ways to try to make sure that we are safe, that our environments are safe. We have people that are working through science to try to make sure that our air is clean, that we have access to clean water, that our environmental systems don't poison us and give us cancer and cause us all kinds of other ailments. And so when we began to look at and understand what the genuine challenges that we have as humanity, it is time for us to come together as humanity. It's time for us to come together and work in cooperation with each other and build a brain trust so that we are using our knowledge, our intelligence, our faculties to begin to solve the problems of the future. So we have people now who are involved in space technologies, rocketry, learning how to understand space and travel in space. And they've even, like the Japanese, for example, sent a robotic ship to an asteroid 180 million miles away to collect samples. And there are asteroids that pass by, like, for example, there's an asteroid that passed by not many years ago that contained the equivalent of about $4 trillion worth of titanium, in addition to nickel and all kinds of other gold and silver and other kinds of metals, strategic metals. And that many of these metals that are available, that are on some of these asteroids, they could be harvested and brought back to Earth and used. They could be used to build space stations. They can be used to build relay stations so that man expands his consciousness and expands his reach into the universe. And so in terms of understanding the future and the survival of humanity, that this is what it's all about. And when we talk about a Black spiritual revival, we're talking about the consciousness and growth of humanity, because it is through this Black spiritual revival, it's through this experience and understanding what has happened and understanding where we are in time and space, that we grow and that we develop, and that we develop this international consciousness, that we begin to understand the bigger picture and understand the world of science and technology. And we began to understand how to solve the problems that man is experiencing on the ground. And so that we can build a society that's productive, that's moving forward in a positive direction. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this history and recognizing who we are, that it's critical for us to grow and develop. And as I bring this to a close, I want to share just a little experience. I can remember being in a situation where I came in the state of North Carolina. And I went to the courthouse. And I don't even think I was going for myself. I was going, I think, for somebody else or something. I went with someone. And I noticed that when I got to the courthouse, there was a Confederate monument on the courthouse lawn. And it had an inscription with a Latin expression that said, Dio vindici, God will vindicate. And I came down from the north and I'm like, wow, a Confederate monument on the public courthouse lawn? How is this possible? Because this was a symbol of, first of all, these people committed treason. When we look at the real facts and look at Texas v. White, the Supreme Court said that their actions were illegal. They committed treason against the United States. They were traitors. And so now I'm coming to a place where they celebrate traitors against America. They celebrate people who unalived Americans. They're celebrating them. They got a monument to them on the courthouse step. They're celebrating people who their whole goal was for black people to be perpetually in slavery so that no black person could be free. This is part of what they propose as a constitution. And so when you begin to look at this and think of a black person who has some knowledge of this stuff. Now, other blacks come to the place, they don't even look up and see the monument. They have no consciousness whatsoever of the monument, what it means, what its history is. They're totally oblivious to it. It's just, they don't even know what it is. But think of someone with some black consciousness that comes in and you see this. What kind of justice would be available in that courthouse? What kind of a justice could be available in that county? And you begin to take a look at this and say, wow, this is a sign and symbol of racism that is so entrenched in this area that racism is foundational to this whole community. What kind of experience and quality of life do black people have here? And then you start talking to black people and you begin to realize the kinds of impairment and damage that's done to black people in this condition, in this situation. We got communities like that all over the place. And they're producing the Black Mega, they're producing the Clarence Thomases, and they're producing the people who are supporting the destruction of the black community now, that are with Donald Trump, that are the Black MAGA and the Black conservative. And when I began to look at this stuff and realize, I hear like people like Charlie Kirk and the things that he said and his subtle way, he was like a subtle racist. He was, expressing ideals that were destructive to black people, that were false, based in a lie, but he did it in such a subtle way that many black people that didn't know their history, don't know anything about their own history, they bought into this crap. And so I'm looking at how this, in the subtlety, I think about in the scripture where it talks about the subtlety of Satan, that how the nature of evil is so subtle that it comes in and it perpetuates itself and promotes evil. And it's so subtle that what it does is it subverts. And I recognize and could see this. And I'm watching this happen in the society. So this is why I have to speak out and call them what they are and tell it like it is. And so, I look at this and I think about this and I understand where we are in time and space, and I recognize the fact that we've got a president, we've got an administration in control, Congress and in the Supreme Court right now are all impacted by this ideology of a YT supremacy, this so-called great replacement theory. And they are all working on this agenda. And so when I look at this and I understand the reality of where we are, then I have to speak out. And when I speak out and I share this information and I actually get a group of people that are part of that and talk to them, if we just talk together, if we just discuss the facts together, what I find is that they just burn out. Their minds just burn out. Because in a reasonable discussion, in a reasonable conversation where we're talking back and forth and it's a free exchange, they become exhausted. Their mind short circuits. They just can't hold up under the truth because what they believe in and the whole foundation of their existence is built on a lie. It's built on a lie, and no lie can live forever. And truth that's crushed to earth will rise again. So in nature, this truth cannot be defeated. In nature, it cannot be defeated in nature. And so we just have to keep speaking it. We just have to keep talking about it because we are in a Black spiritual revival. Be blessed and have a wonderful day. Thank you for taking the time to listen.